The story begins with a ruthless criminal by the name of Frank Morris, who is being sent off to a high-security prison called Alcatraz. This Alcatraz prison was situated on an island right in the middle of the ocean, a place from which no inmate had ever managed to escape. But Frank had already made a name for himself by breaking out of multiple prisons in the past. He was renowned specifically for his ability to flee confinement. As for Alcatraz, nobody had even considered escaping from there, let alone actually tried it. The moment Frank arrived at the prison, he was subjected to a thorough search before being taken to his cell, where he was expected to spend the rest of his life. The next day, during breakfast, Frank met an elderly inmate named Litmus, who had a pet rat that he treated like a cherished companion. While Frank was conversing with Litmus, he noticed another prisoner named Wolf, who was openly provoking him. Frank, however, chose to ignore Wolf's taunts for the time being, and continued his chat with Litmus. Shortly thereafter, Frank was summoned to the warden's office for a briefing, during which the warden threatened him not to even think about escaping. Many had come and gone, the warden said, but no one had succeeded in fleeing. Yet, in the midst of that very lecture, Frank quietly stole a nail cutter from the warden's room. Although a nail cutter seemed like a very small item, Frank realized that in a place like Alcatraz, even the smallest of objects could prove incredibly valuable. As soon as he was back in his cell, Frank hid that nail cutter inside his Bible. A little while later, during a group shower, Wolf approached Frank yet again and started harassing him. This time, Frank was not in the mood to ignore him, so he grabbed Wolf and began beating him. This incident earned Frank a kind of reputation within the prison, and after that, no one wanted to hassle him unnecessarily. Over time, the prison library turned into Frank's second home. That was where he met the prison librarian, English, who had also been sentenced to life in Alcatraz. Because of his life sentence, English had given up on any thought of returning to the outside world, and he spent his days absorbed in books. In fact, both he and Frank shared a deep fondness for history books, which led to a strong friendship between them. During that same period, Frank became acquainted with yet another inmate named Doc, a remarkable artist who spent the majority of his time painting. Doc believed that in a dangerous prison like Alcatraz, anyone could lose their mind, and he credited his painting habit with keeping him sane up to that point. That very evening, a guard told Frank about a carpenter's job in the prison that paid 15 cents an hour. But troubles were about to escalate for Frank sooner than he expected. One day, when all the inmates were out of their cells, Wolf showed up once again, and this time, he had a weapon with him. He intended to attack Frank with it, but right at the last second, Doc alerted Frank, giving Frank enough time to use his jacket to deflect the strike. A fight broke out between Wolf and Frank, and when the guards attempted to break them apart, Wolf even lashed out at one of the guards. As a result, both Wolf and Frank were thrown into D-Block's solitary confinement. In solitary, prisoners were kept completely alone in a small cage-like cell, a place no inmate ever wanted to end up. And now Frank had been shoved into that cage simply because he needed to defend himself, which made him furiously angry. After spending 2 weeks in that cage, Frank was finally released, and Litmus sent him a welcome note via his pet rat to cheer him up. Once he was back, Frank also befriended his neighbor Charlie, who was serving time for a serious theft. Charlie confided in Frank about how much he regretted trying to cross the border to escape, because that mistake had made his crime look even graver. The very next day, the warden decided to make an unannounced visit around the prison. During this inspection, the warden noticed a portrait of himself painted by Doc. Although at first, the warden seemed pleased by how it looked. In the next moment, he unexpectedly ordered every painting Doc had ever created to be taken out of the prison. For Doc, who lived only for his art, this felt like an earth-shattering blow. He deeply loved each and every painting he created, and painting was all he had to keep himself going. Frank attempted to console Doc by telling him that there was no use in dwelling on it. After all, it was just a painting, and life had to go on within those walls. But Doc could not overcome the shock. One day, during his work shift, Doc cut off 3 of his own fingers. This was his way of rebelling against the warden. Immediately after that happened, the guards called for medical help, while Frank stood there silently, simply watching Doc. Later that night, as Frank sat in his cell, he noticed a cockroach crawling out of the vent. Seeing that insect made him suspect that the vent might be connected to some exit that led outside. At about the same time, English informed Frank that the real reason the warden had thrown out all of Doc's paintings was that he actually disliked how his own portrait had turned out. The next time they were in the dining hall for a meal, Frank encountered 2 brothers named John and Clarence, who recognized him from a previous prison they had all been in. Chatting among themselves, they brought up Alcatraz, mentioning that the prison was entirely surrounded by water, making escape virtually impossible. From their point of view, it seemed they would spend the rest of their lives there. However, this conversation planted a new idea in Frank's mind. Now he wanted to make history by becoming the very first person ever to escape from Alcatraz. That same night, Frank used the nail cutter he had stolen from the warden's office to start chipping away at the cement around the grill in his cell. Whenever he heard the guard's footsteps approaching, he would hastily hide the nail cutter in his Bible and pretend to be reading scripture, so nobody would suspect him. Over time, his efforts started to pay off, and little by little, the cement around the vent grill began to weaken. Meanwhile, during visiting hours, English and Charlie both had visits from their families. English felt uneasy talking to his daughter, who had grown up quite a bit in his absence, and he was devastated that he had missed her entire childhood. Meanwhile, Charlie learned from his wife that his elderly mother's health was failing, and according to the doctor's latest assessment, she had only a few months left to live. That news ignited in Charlie a desperate desire to escape from Alcatraz. The very next morning, as everyone sat down for breakfast, Frank shared his plan for escaping the prison with John and Charlie. According to Frank, the salt water and constant exposure to sea air had weakened the prison structure. By chipping away at the cement, they could detach the ventilation grills, crawl through them, then navigate the pipelines and make their exit from there. But the big question remained. Even if they did manage to slip out of the prison itself, how would they cross the ocean? At that point, Frank explained that Clarence worked in the prison's clothing department, so Clarence could gradually smuggle out raincoats and small amounts of rubber cement. According to Frank, he knew exactly how to fashion life rafts and life jackets, and he told them to just trust him with the details of that part. Everyone found Frank's plan appealing, so they agreed to work on it together. That night, as usual, Frank was focused on scraping away the cement in his cell. But this time, Charlie was helping by keeping an eye out from his own cell so that no guard would discover their plan. On the one hand, Frank's progress was steady, but because the nail cutter was so small, the job was time-consuming and required a lot of force. Also, it was not particularly sharp, which forced Frank to exert more effort. And in the process, he ended up with several injuries on his hands that were causing him considerable pain. The following morning, Frank told everyone about the difficulties he was facing, and they agreed that they needed a bigger, more powerful tool. That was when Frank's eyes fell upon his spoon. He quickly smeared it with grime on his shoe to make it look dirty, then called a guard to complain about the spoon. The rest joined in and asked if they could exchange their dirty spoons. Since there was nothing evidently suspicious about this, the guard said yes, but as soon as they approached the front desk to swap out the spoons, John distracted the guard with small talk, and Frank took advantage of that moment to discreetly slip an extra spoon into his pocket. Even that, however, was not enough for what they needed, which is why Frank made a deal with Litmus, trading away his share of sweets for 20 days to acquire additional materials. After that, Frank melted the spoon and attached it to the nail cutter and a coin, creating a brand new device far more effective than the original nail cutter. That same night, Frank was once again enthusiastically scraping away the cement when a guard suddenly came by, a guard Charlie had failed to spot in time. But fortunately, English stepped in at just the right moment to divert the guard's attention, allowing Charlie to bang on the prison bars and signal Frank to hide everything. Alerted by the sound, Frank managed to stash his tools. They narrowly avoided getting caught this time, but Frank realized he could not put his full trust in Charlie from that point onward. After a few days, Frank discovered that screws were securing the grills in place, so they would need yet another tool to remove them. Whenever Frank had a chance to go outside, he would discreetly dispose of the cement bits he had scraped off by tossing them out. While working in the carpenter's shop, Frank secretly crafted a small instrument, but to take it out of the workshop, he had to sneak it past the metal detector. To accomplish that, he held a rusty piece of iron in his hand so that when the detector beeped, he could hand that worthless chunk to the guard. Meanwhile, his real tool remained hidden in his shoe. As soon as he got back to his cell, he used that new tool to open the grill. Behind it was a maze of pipes, which might well lead them to freedom. But Frank knew that they needed to plan things much more meticulously, which is why they decided to create fake heads, dummy human skulls, that could fool the guards. They instantly started collecting the necessary materials. John would gather hair from the barbershop, Charlie would organize the paint, and Frank, with the help of English, stockpiled a large number of old newspapers. Once everything was gathered, Frank set to work. He soaked the newspapers and mixed them with cement, scraped off the walls to form a head-like shape, then coated it with paint and stuck real hair on it. The goal was to place these dummy heads in their bunks as decoys for the guards. To make the illusion even more convincing, Charlie fashioned counterfeit grills that closely resembled the originals, so that when they made their escape, they could place these phony grills back where the real ones had been, making it less likely the guards would notice a thing. One particular night, Frank decided to go up alone, using the dummy head and the fake grill. Once he climbed up through the pipe, he discovered a heavy iron door blocking the way, and he could not reach it on his own. Right then, a guard began patrolling the cell blocks. When he got to Frank's cell, his suspicions were briefly aroused, but somehow Frank still managed to avoid detection. This incident made it obvious that they needed to adjust their plan. The next morning, Frank and Charlie discussed what had happened the previous night, and by then, John and Clarence had also prepared their own dummy heads. Ultimately, all four decided to move ahead with the same escape plan. That very night, John and Charlie climbed up to the iron door again, working together to reach it. Upon touching the door, they realized it could be cut through, but they would need some high-powered cutting tool to get the job done. During the following day's music class, Charlie spotted an old fan in the room. Immediately, it occurred to him that it might serve as the perfect piece of hardware they needed. He made a deal with Litmus, trading all his sweets for the fan. To get it out of the class unnoticed, Charlie placed it in an instrument box and carried it out without rousing suspicion. As soon as the fan came into Frank's possession, he set about turning it into a specialized tool. That very night, they returned to the iron door. Equipped with this new device, they cut right through the door. It generated a lot of noise, some of which reached the guards, but they dismissed it without further thought. With the door now breached, Frank and his partners had carved out their path to freedom. They decided they would break out of the world's most secure prison, Alcatraz, on Tuesday night. However, on Tuesday morning at breakfast, Frank placed a flower on the table to honor Doc's memory. The warden noticed it at once and angrily reminded Frank of the prison rules before crushing the flower underfoot. Litmus was so enraged by the warden's actions that he tried to lunge forward, but in that moment, he was hit by a sudden heart attack and collapsed right there. Not long afterward, the warden also carried out a surprise inspection of Frank's cell, but found nothing. Furious, the warden ordered that Charlie and Frank be moved to different cells. Meanwhile, Wolf had been released from solitary confinement and was once more poised to attack Frank. But as soon as he tried, English stepped in and grabbed him. That night, Frank, John, Charlie, and Clarence had agreed to rendezvous in the pipe system. But at the critical moment, Charlie got cold feet and decided not to go through with it. The other three, though, pressed ahead with their plan exactly as they had arranged. Charlie stood by and watched his dream of freedom slip away right before his eyes, all because of his own fear. Meanwhile, going step by cautious step to avoid the searchlights, Frank, John, and Clarence reached the prison's outer wall. After checking to ensure no one was watching, they quietly scaled the wall and left the prison behind. Soon enough, they crossed a small road and arrived at the water's edge. Each of them knew his exact role by heart, and they worked in complete silence, yet with lightning speed. They rapidly inflated their makeshift boat, blowing it up by mouth, which was exhausting and extremely challenging. But they were motivated to save their own lives and managed to do it. At last, the three of them launched into the water, determined to leave the confines of Alcatraz forever. The following morning, when the guards came to do their rounds, everything initially appeared normal. However, then they noticed that Frank was still lying in his bunk, apparently fast asleep. The moment they pulled down the blanket to check on him, they were left completely stunned, because what they were looking at wasn't Frank, but a dummy head he had placed there in his stead. Immediately, word spread throughout the prison that some inmates had pulled off an escape. Frank had used a fake head to fool them. The guards raised the alarm at once. Soon it became clear that 2 additional inmates were missing as well, so the pursuit began. Boats and even helicopters were deployed to locate them, but there was no trace of Frank, John, and Clarence. Some of the police believed that perhaps the 3 men had drowned in the ocean. Yet deep down, the warden suspected that they had survived, and he was acutely aware that the so-called most secure prison in the world, Alcatraz, had been outsmarted by escaping convicts. But the warden also felt the weight of safeguarding the prison's reputation, and so he publicly declared that the 3 escapees must have perished. Truthfully, however, almost nobody believed the warden's story. This is a true tale, after which Frank came to be known worldwide as the genius jailbreaker. The secret search operation continued for a year, yet no bodies were ever discovered. That only confirmed that they had, in fact, succeeded in escaping to freedom. If you enjoyed the video, remember to give it a like and subscribe to the channel.